A shard of mirror skittered across the flagstone, while High Matron Alira's finger completed the final burnished curve of the sigil. The initiate gasped, held the slate against their temple, and stopped saying names. A litany of sounds cut in half with the slate's slap. Suspicion tightened the narrator's jaw as he moved closer. He had come to observe, not to be drawn into a rite. He kept his voice low and his hands empty, watching the white ash flake from Alira's fingertips onto the slate's edge. The narrator did not wait for introductions. He took 2 steps into the vaulted chamber, knelt to steady the initiate's elbow, and felt the body going slack beneath his hand. "Who were you before this?" he asked. The initiate blinked and traced a circle on the slate with a trembling finger. No name. The initiate in a breath that meant nothing and everything. Alira's attendants moved like machines, sweeping ash into a tin and folding the slate into a linen wrap. Within the first minutes, the central problem stood plain. This order erased particular memories and then called that erasure salvation. The narrator's curiosity shifted into a controlled anger when an acolyte, Mara, quietly closed the chamber door. Mara's wrist cords had the same ashen gray as the initiate's tunic. She kept her head down and avoided the narrator's eyes. "Stay back, Alira, not as a request. The rite completes itself. Observation may bind the witness," Alira's voice carried across cut stone. Her altar was flat, certain. The narrator extracted his brass monocle and set it on his nose, breathing through the scent that clung to him. Old paper and smoke. He watched the initiate's fingers stop at the slate's edge, the knuckles whitening. Suspicion pushed him to examine evidence rather than to argue. He Alira for the slate after the attendants had stepped away. Alira accepted the request with a slow tilt of her head. "Brother Joran will record the slate," she said, naming the scribe who kept the ledger. "We do not give names to outsiders without reason. Memory is a contagion. We purge to free the soul." Her hand went to the wooden staff topped with a mirrored shard. She kept that shard like a promise. The narrator followed the attendants down a narrow corridor into a room lined with shelves. The archivist sat at a single lamp, hunched over a ledger the size of a child's chest. He introduced himself without pretense. "Brother Joran," he said, and his voice scraped parchment. He pointed to a column of crossed-out names. "We record the names we release. That way, the order knows whom it has made silent." Brother Joran turned the page with a thumb stained brown. He tapped a name and said, "The name binds the ledger to the right. We only cross what Alira decrees." The narrator which names were chosen. Joran's mouth pinched, those tied to kinship of the old lines, to debts and cities where memory breeds return, he said. He did not smile. "Records must be kept. Forgetting is not random." The ledger was precise and brutal. Columns recorded birthplaces, crimes alleged by accusers, and the dates scheduled for erasure. Every entry was followed by a stamp of ash or a smudge that Joran called the seal of release. The narrator photographed a page with a hand that did not shake, though his scalp prickled. He recorded specific entries. A woman from the riverside village, a man accused of kin betrayal, an unnamed merchant. The room smelled of lamp oil and lignin. As night settled, the narrator confronted Alira in the courtyard where veiled watchers stood like sentinels. He held the slate in a linen wrap and demanded clarity. "High Matron Alira," he said, "whose memories do you take?" Alira tilted her head. "Those whose memories cling to worldly debt and blood, those who would drag others into the past. We excise the chain. We prepare the soul to be born again, free from ancestry's stain." She tapped the shard on her staff against her palm. "Do you think there is cruelty when a debt is repaid? You call it repayment, the narrator, but you are deciding what counts as a debt. Who gave you that right?" His voice kept level, but his fingers closed around the slate. Alira answered in a ritual cadence. "We were given the knowledge. We read the sigils, and the ash tells us whom to free. Brother Joran records what the ritual demands." The exchange tightened. Mara stepped forward and said, "Leave us the path, narrator." Do not bend the ritual's course with questions. Her voice was low, then more sharply. You do not know what it does for us, Mara. Alira softly. We teach what the ledger shows. Leave him to his study or let him read under supervision. Alira's words framed the choice, an authority that halted the courtyard's murmurs. The narrator chose to read. Back in the archive with a lamp between them, Brother Joran guided the narrator to a smaller folio. He leaned close, breath warm with ink, and turned to a page written in quick strokes. The narrator's monocle caught the lamplight, and the script blurred and snapped into focus. He photographed the folio, and while composing his frame, found a name crossed with ritual ash that made his fingers go cold. The name was not a stranger's. It matched a surname his mother used before she married, a surname the narrator had only seen once on a child's ribbon. His stomach dropped into a place that was not only dread but a knot of familial responsibility. Shock pushed into action. He flipped further pages, hands trembling now, demanding an explanation. Brother Joran watched without surprise. Many of us carry blood of cities and lines we no longer speak. Alira purges according to lineage and crime, but also according to potential. The ledger carries a caution as much as a record. His voice had a wariness that suggested complicity and regret. Sometimes the ledger marks a living stock to prevent future harm. The narrator read the entry aloud in a voice that cut the lamp's hush. Garan, crossed out. Scheduled after solstice. He looked up. Garan is my uncle's name, he said. How long has this been here? Joran's hand rested on the ledger. Months. The matron keeps that schedule. Records move with her decisions. The discovery became the chapter's turning point. Scholarly curiosity edged into personal peril. The narrator's mind shifted from suspicion to anger to a cold fear. He could not leave the ledger where it lay. He Joran for the folio to copy the margins, and the scribe hesitated. If you take it uncontrolled, Joran, it will be noticed. Alira will notice. That ledger is the Order S spine. The narrator looked at the scribe and saw the lines dug at the corners of his eyes. Joran added, Do you intend to take action? That is not the role of an archivist. The narrator answered with an action. He tucked the camera into his satchel, folded the photographs into a leather wallet, and stood. I intend to know, he said. If Garan is marked, someone must speak for him. The scribe's mouth tightened. Then you are part of the ledger now, Joran. Words bind us all. An episode of quiet followed, then an event that broke the rhythm. At dusk they carried the initiate to the reflecting pool near the lake. The procession moved in single file. Torches spat shadows across their faces. The narrator followed, keeping his hands empty, watching the way the acolytes held their shoulders like columns. At the lakeside, Alira set the initiate on the edge of smooth water. She held her mirrored shard over the surface and whispered the litany. The water canned the torchlight into a low ring. The initiate swallowed, eyes searching. For a moment a name unspooled from the throat, a single memory of a woman's laugh at a market stall. The initiate flinched and reached toward that remembered sound, too late. Alira's hand struck the mirrored shard downward and the light split. The narrator moved to seize that shard. No, he said. He reached out, fingers flashing. Alira, wait. Alira's attendant, Mara, moved to block him. Back, narrator, she said, stepping forward. His fingers closed on the shard's corner. It bit his palm and blood bloomed bright against his sleeve. He hissed but did not let go. Alira's face did not change expression as she said, You crossed the rite's boundary. You forced the ritual's hand. We will finish what is begun. Her staff hit the ground like a verdict. The acolytes formed a ring. The initiate began to thrash, calling a name that ended in a choked throat. The narrator lunged, trying to keep the shard from slicing the last recollection. The confrontation became a physical clash. Drop it! Mara shouted, drop it now! The narrator pulled back and Mara struck at his wrist. The shard tore a shallow line across his palm. Narrator Alira, calm as a metronome. The ritual requires an ending. You would undo what you saw. Close your hand. The narrator would not. He twisted, wrenched. and a scuffle started, 3 rapid exchanges of motion and shouted names. Acolytes pressed him down, hands closed on his coat. A sudden sound came from the water. A single splash as the initiate's slate slipped from their fingers into the black. For a breath the thrashing stopped and every head turned. That instant was the chapter's mini cliffhanger. The audience and the narrator realized that a single object could erase or preserve a name depending on who held it. The narrator's anger changed to a sharper, more precise fear. If the slate fell, the last trace of the initiate's name would be gone, and no ledger could restore it. Alira stepped forward and snapped a line of command. "Bind him," she said to Mara. 2 acolytes seized the narrator's shoulders. He twisted, spoke the names of his mother and of Garin in a rush, trying to make his kin sound present and stubborn. "My name is on your ledger," he said. "You cannot claim the right to cross my blood without proof." His words were urgent, quick. Alira's answer was not an argument. She put the mirrored shard against the pool and pressed until a fine mist rose. "We act for the order," she said. "We act to prevent return. We spare the living from their own repeating sins." The matron's voice moved across the small ring of people and made a few of the acolytes shift uneasily. "You are not bound to the ledger, narrator, unless you step into its pages," the narrator did. He tried to wrench free, and in the struggle a slip of cloth fell from Alira's robe. Under the folds a small pouch of ash tumbled and the air filled with a dry metallic tang. Acolytes coughed. The initiates stopped calling out and turned their head with blank eyes. Alira closed the rite with a single motion, sweeping the shard and brushing it along the pocket where the initiate's slate had rested. "Purified," she intoned. The initiates stood then, but their eyes were empty of personal history. They did not know the market woman's laugh or their mother's face. The crowd exhaled. Mara's jaw worked, and she would not meet the narrator's face. The narrator was shoved back to the threshold of the ritual compound and left clutching partial evidence. Photographs, a folded page, a smear of ash on his sleeve. He tasted blood and lake water in the air. He had forced the order to finish the erasure earlier than they intended, and the cost lay in the initiates hollowing out. The narrator's hands shook. He pressed the photographs into his satchel, as if holding them close would keep the names intact. That night, alone in a cold private study, the narrator held a shattered mirror fragment and turned it over beneath a lamp. The shard's edge caught lamplight, and a nick on his palm bled into the silver. He opened the ledger again to the page where Garen's name had been crossed out. He compared script and signature, measured dates with the monocle. There was a marginal note in a different hand, to be held until the solstice by order of Alira. The narrator tapped the margin with a cautious finger. He paused, then laid the mirror fragment and the scorched amulet side by side on the table. The amulet's sigil had a faint glow when tilted. When he pressed it, the glow faded. He wrapped both in linen and placed them into his small satchel where the camera lay. He numbered the photographs in his ledger and wrote a single line beside Garen's entry. "Investigate." Noted by matron, he did not sleep. He catalogued evidence by actions, folding, photographing, sealing, because action held steadier than speculation. He rehearsed a plan. Confront Joran again, appeal to the veiled watchers, or find Garen before the solstice. Each option shifted his emotion from fear back toward focused resolve. He would not let the ledger swallow a relative without contest. The last sound of the night was not introspection but a concrete knock. 3 short, deliberate raps at his study door. He froze, then rose and moved to the door. He unlatched it and opened to a single, veiled figure on the threshold, a messenger with a small wax packet and a single ash smear across their knuckle. "A message for you," the messenger said from the courtyard. "The matron requests your presence at dawn." He looked at the narrator and let the silence hang. The narrator took the packet, feeling the wax give under his thumb. He closed the door and set the packet on his table beside the wrapped shard and the ledger's photograph. He did not write conclusions or promises. He prepared instead. He replaced the monocle in his satchel, wrapped the shard tighter, and slid his hand over the ledger's photograph until his fingertips met paper. The chapter ended with the concrete act of stepping toward the outer gate where, at dawn, he would face Alira again. A ledger lay open when the narrator pushed the archive door. An entire column of names had been cut away, the parchment ragged where ink had once lived. Suspicion tightened the narrator's jaw within the first heartbeat. He tapped the margin with a gloved fingertip and felt the stiff ash dust along the torn edge. Archivist Mari and the scribe at the low table flinched, lifting a hand smeared with charcoal. The narrator moved past the table and smelled the same resin and old paper he always noted. The concrete discovery made the problem immediate. Names were being erased outside ritual record, and someone in the archive had touched the proof. The narrator set his satchel on a stool and spoke without ceremony. Who erased this column? Archivist Mari did not answer at once. She turned the page to a ledger dated to the month of the last purging. Her fingers stopped on a list of births. We mark erasure with a slash. This has no mark. The narrator watched her face for signs of concealment. The word suspicion had appeared in his throat and pushed his hands into investigation. He opened his leather-bound notebook and began to copy the ledger entry line by line. High Matron Alira entered the vault in ceremonial wraps, her staff tapping a measured rhythm on the flagstone as if marking a liturgy. She did not smile. Explain. Her voice held the order of the inner court. Acolytes backed from the shelves to give her space. The narrator closed his notebook only when Alira's eyes rested on the torn margin. He heard the initiate's breath behind him and felt the young recruit's small body nearly collide with his elbow. The immediate conflict, names removed, rulership questioned, stated itself in action rather than interpretation. Suspicion shifted to doubt among those present. The narrator recorded each movement. Archivist Mari pointed to a lower shelf and said, Acolyte Maro was sorting ledgers last evening. Senior Acolyte Maro rose from an easel and said, I sorted what I was told to sort. His fingers were blunt from leather work. His voice was curt. Alira's hand tightened on the staff, and she walked toward Maro, she said. Did you remove any entries without my sanction? Maro folded his arms. No, High Matron. The narrator watched Maro's eyes shift to the initiate and then away. Maro's knuckles whitened. The narrator recorded the exchange, noting the hesitation and the way Maro would not meet Alira's gaze when the missing names included a certain bloodline. The initiate stood in the doorway with a slate in hand and would not speak the required name when Alira commanded. She tapped the slate against her temple and said, Say the name. The initiate's voice failed on the consonants. The sound choked and the slate struck the floor. Alira moved close and read the slate's blank face as if it were a witness. The narrator felt doubt move into fear when Alira reached for the initiate's wrist and found the cord around it damp with sweat. Acolytes muttered. The narrator stepped forward, holding up his notebook. The initiate has the cord, said Senior Acolyte Maro, quick to redirect. Perhaps the cord binds them. Maro, Alira. Do not divert. Her tilt of head carried accusation. The initiate's hands shook and she kept her eyes on the slate. Junior Acolyte Sarah moved nearer and whispered to a fellow acolyte. The narrator recorded Sarah's movement and the whisper. They were taken in the night. The exchange forced a new reveal within the circle. Someone had been removing names at odd hours. The narrator's suspicion became distrust toward the Order's procedures. The narrator demanded access to the night logs. Archivist Mari led him to a low desk and pulled a drawer of script, bound notations where each act of sanctioned forgetting was recorded with a seal. He studied the seals and found several that bore no matron's mark. They were stamped with a thin crescent he did not recognize. These entries are unauthorized. Mari slid a smaller page toward him, the handwriting cramped and hurried. The page held a list of family names with single words scrawled beside them. Cleared, unneeded, obsolete. The narrator traced the line with his finger. The physical evidence made the problem concrete. The order's forgetting had been redirected to purge specific bloodlines. Marrow protested then, quick and sharp, we follow the matron's decree. If she speaks, I obey. Alira's eyes did not soften. Marrow, she replied, obedience is not silence when sacrilege strikes. Bring forth the ledger you carried last night. Marrow's jaw clenched. He went to a nearest shelf, removed a leather folio, and its spine creaked. He set it on the stone bench and opened to the previous evening's entries. The narrator watched Marrow's hands. They trembled on the corners of the page. Here. See the gaps? The narrator compared the two ledgers side by side. The pattern formed. Names associated with a single family had been excised and witnesses who might testify had been struck from separate lists. In the darkened aisle, archivist Mari found a torn token on the floor where an acolyte had dropped it by accident. She bent and lifted the scrap. It bore a partial name in ink rubbed with ash. The initiate's eyes widened at the sight, and she reached for the token before Mari tucked it into her palm. The sudden movement caused a low commotion. Sarah stepped out of the shadows and murmured to Keth across the corridor. The narrator kept a precise record. The torn token contained a forbidden personal name. He saw recognition flash across the initiate's face like a light quickly extinguished. Her lips formed the family name, then closed. The narrator wrote the syllables as if they were physical objects, faint strokes of ink on a slate. Outside the aisles, two junior acolytes, Sarah and Keith, spoke in hushed tones and revealed an unexpected confession. We hide some collections, Sarah. Certain families pay to keep a memory safe. Keith nodded and added, not payment like coin. Tokens, favors, names to spare. Their hands kept quick, small gestures, pulling at robes, checking for watches. The narrator stepped closer and asked, who authorized this? Neither named Alira directly, but their description implied a network of elders quietly roting memory extraction to settle old scores. The narrator recorded the confession and felt suspicion morph into a clearer sense of injustice. The theft of memory was not only doctrinal, it had become political. Alira convened an emergency council in the inner court at dusk. Candles clustered on low tables, throwing hard, edged pools of light that revealed faces in half. She stood at the raised dais and said, someone has violated the right. This is sacrilege and betrayal. A murmur answered, then silence. Senior acolyte Marrow stepped forward and said, I admit discrepancies. High matron. Alira's face did not change. Name the conspirators, she demanded. Marrow swallowed and then said, I do not know every hand, but I have seen ledgers moved at night. The narrator watched the council. He noted how Alira's public decree consolidated her authority. She offered those implicated a stark choice: confess and be purged, or remain silent and face the order's full weight. The narrator and archivist Mari spent midnight in the archivist's study mapping erased entries. He spread ledgers across a long table and matched names to dates. They found a pattern, a cluster of erased witnesses and births, all leading to a single bloodline. Mari, they removed those who could tie families to an older scandal. The narrator tapped each entry with his pen. He found signatures missing where witnesses would have testified to atrocities in exchanges between families and the order. This is not spiritual cleansing. This is a purge. Mari's fingers hovered over the ink and hesitated, then pressed down, leaving a small stain. The narrator's doubt had shifted into an argument grounded in evidence. Forgetting as political weapon. For days the narrator observed rituals and read through petitions. The initiate's failure to speak a name returned to trouble the court. During a public forgetting rite at dusk, the narrator stood at the outer ring while Alira and acolytes formed the center. He watched the ritual motions. Slaps of the slate against the brow, the low intonation of the litany, the careful turning of a sealed bundle. Mid-ceremony, a conspirator hurled a sealed bundle into the circle. The bundle burst open on the flagstone and scattered parchments like thrown papers, names written in hurried hand. The narrator heard the parchment slap and the sound translated to names shouted aloud. One name reached the initiate's ears and sparked something like recognition. She spoke it in full, clear and horrified. The assembly broke. Alira lunged forward as if to snatch the papers, and the narrator saw the matron's face harden into the shape of command. The abrupt reveal of names reoriented the room. Junior acolyte Sarah shouted, "Name! Name!" Senior acolyte Marrow cursed and reached for a falling sheet. The narrator kept his pen poised over the page and wrote down the exact sequence. The bundle thrown, parchments scattering, the initiate naming a family. He observed Alira lunge and the way acolytes split to contain the breach. The physical scramble, hands, skirts, dust in candlelight, replaced rumor with evidence in the hearing of everyone present. A rapid exchange followed. "Stop!" Alira barked. "Who threw it?" Marrow demanded. "I did," said a voice from the back. "Junior acolyte Sarah, we kept names hidden. We reveal them now." Her face was pale and resolute. The narrator watched the council tilt on that declaration. The exchange contained the sharp back, and, forth the narrator expected, accusation and defense, confession and retaliation. Alira's response was immediate and precise. "Sarah, Alira, you committed sacrilege. I expose sacrilege," Sarah answered. Marrow stepped between them. "Alira, control your acolytes." This was an act of desperation. The narrator noted the cadence of the argument and how the voices shifted the crowd's attention. The room's tension spiked. The public ritual designed to erase now forced memory into speech. The narrator's fear rose when Alira ordered the immediate containment of the conspirators and signaled acolytes to seize the papers. The crowd surged. The narrator caught a falling name as it slid under a bench and tucked it in his sleeve without thinking. He recognized one of the names from the midnight ledger. A witness who had been vanished from 2 separate records. Acolytes wrestled in the candlelight and the initiate pressed close to the narrator as if for protection. She whispered. They wanted them gone. Her hands trembled around the thin cord on her wrist, and the narrator saw how tightly she squeezed it until the cord creased the skin. The narrator's emotions shifted again from fear to a shaped determination to record and to expose. He stepped forward, voice low but steady. "Alira," he said, "you must let the records speak. Those names matter to the living." Alira's gaze slid to him with a mix of contempt and calculation. She raised a hand and ordered the acolytes to cleanse the circle, contain the breach. She said, "Collect the papers. Burn what is blasphemous." Hands moved to gather parchments. The narrator felt the ritual closing in on itself. A public humiliation converted into a purge of dissent. He saw several acolytes slip out with handfuls of documents beneath cloaks. The narrator recorded these furtive exits. That night a quiet of a different sort descended. Alira ordered increased surveillance and moved the initiate to a small cell in the inner wing for intensified erasure. The narrator accompanied Archivist Mari to a back room where Mari spread 3 torn tokens and pointed to the partial inked names. "These are not ritual marks," she said. "They are choices made by men and women who decide who should vanish." The narrator set the tokens beside his notebook and photographed each with a dawn lamp he carried. He felt the group's apparatus tighten, a ritual-turned instrument, the order's authority now weaponized. Fear had returned, but beneath it the narrator's resolve stiffened. Junior acolyte Sarah vanished into the night with a small sack of tokens and a whisper for the narrator. "If you want proof, follow the lower road to the 3rd gate at dawn." Sarah's eyes did not plead. They instructed. The narrator watched her leave, then turned back to the archivist. Mari folded her hands and said, "We keep records to remember who we have forgone. If someone changes those records, we lose truth." The narrator tapped the tokens and thought of the shard of mirror from his earlier notes. He remembered the mirror skittering across the flagstone in the Vault of Forgetting, and how Alira had finished the sigil then. He connected that event to the ledger gap. The mirror shard had been a witness. Now names were being erased in secret. Under the outer cloister, the narrator made a decision. He placed one torn token into his satchel and sealed the flap. He would not let the evidence disappear. He planned to trace the names back to families who might still remember what the order had taken. As he stepped toward the outer stair, he felt a footstep above him, someone on the watch. He paused, listening to the cadence of boots on stone. The concrete sound told him what the whispered fears could not. The order had tightened its net. The narrator left the ledger open on the table for Alira to find. The chapter closed with voices in the distance and a physical beat that connected the present to the coming danger. Archivist Mari whispered, "Be careful. They will not let this go." The narrator tucked his notebook under his arm, ran a thumb across the torn edge of the token in his satchel, and heard a footstep on the outer stair. His suspicion had traveled into resolve, and the night held a promise of pursuit as the outer door clicked shut behind him. They shoved the initiate into the ritual pool. Slate met temple with a hard smack and water hissed around linen. Suspicion tightened his jaw and pushed him forward. The narrator moved along the amphitheater steps with the archive key in his palm, watching how the acolytes smudged ink from the open list. He kept his voice low but steady as he addressed no one. "Hold the slate still." That single sentence landed in the circle and made 3 heads turn. The conflict was immediate. The cult displayed its power to remove identity, and he, the scholar, had to know whether that power was holy or a tool of control. Suspicion, cold and precise, was the emotion that guided him into every choice that night. He remembered the shard of mirror from the vault of forgetting. He had seen it skitter across flagstone as High Matron Alira completed a sigil, and the initiate's slate had silenced his naming. The memory of that shard pushed him now, step by step, to the pool rail. He watched the initiate's fingers curl around the thin cord at the wrist, felt the salt and ash on his own fingertips where he had brushed the ledger in the archive. The problem was concrete. The cult erased names on lists, and yet some names persisted. Someone was hiding those persistent names, and the ledger suggested an audit had been carried out. He had to find that erased entry and prove whether forgetting served salvation or maintained a brutal order. Acolytes chanted in a low, measured rhythm. High Matron Alira stood on the pool ledge wrapped in layered robes, staff in hand. Her voice carried. "Speak nothing that binds the soul," she enunciated each word like a law. The initiate's lips trembled, then stilled under the slate's weight. Not their faults, Alira to the circle, only their chains. The narrator noted the tilt of her head, and the way her knuckles tapped before she spoke, and suspicion shifted into a hunt for confirmation. A young acolyte smeared a name with ritual ash. The narrator stepped into the shadowed alcove and reached for a small lamp to read the ledger by. The lamp flame smelled of resin. He found the column where ink had been scraped away and traced the ragged edge with a gloved fingertip. The ash left a dark line under his nail. He touched the edge and thought of the ledger in the memory audit, the column torn where ink had once lived. He had seen the torn margin before. Now he held a damp, half-burned scrap pressed into his palm by a silent scribe. The scent of smoke and wet paper made his mouth dry. The scrap bore a single, erased name and the shape of a scratch that matched a private mark he had seen reflected in a mirrored shard earlier. "What is that?" he demanded, holding the fragment up so the scribe could see. The scribe only bowed and vanished into the crowd. The narrator felt a second emotion arrive, unease, when the scribe would not speak. The silence forced him to act. He could either announce discovery and risk chaos, or record the evidence quietly and follow it later. He chose to move through the crowd, watch the ritual, and keep the scrap hidden in the inner pocket of his coat. The initiate gasped and then stilled. A child's laugh slipped out from under the slate. The circle jerked. The sound was a concrete memory. A boy calling a name into a courtyard, the brittle call of a neighbor, the smell of bread baking in the morning. The initiate one name, clear and accidental. Lyora, the acolyte, stiffened. Alira's face did not change, her eyes did. The narrator heard the order snap from her lips. Bind him. Bring the shard. The tension climbed, and the narrator's unease moved into immediate action. Acolytes seized the initiate and tied linen cords around wrists. The narrator pushed forward and said, "Alyra, what is that name?" His voice cut through the chant. Alira's alto filled the space. "You do not ask that here, scholar." Her cadence held ceremonial weight. He pressed. "Why punish the sound of a name?" Alyra tapped the staff on stone. "Names are anchors," she said. "Anchors drag the soul into the world that folds it." The narrator heard doctrine, but watched bodies. He recorded the way Alyra's fingers brushed the mirrored shard at her staff's top, as if to steady herself. The narrator had followed doctrine before, letters and testimonies in the archive, but doctrine on a ledge and doctrine in ink were different. He moved to pry a witness from a line of acolytes. "Did you hear him clearly?" he asked one. The acolyte, Palin, blinked and answered simply, "I heard the name, narrator. I heard it like anyone hears a child's shout." Palin's voice was short and factual. The narrator noted Palin's clarity and later would write it down. Alyra mounted a higher stone and took center. She pronounced the theology of forgetting in a sequence of small, exact claims. Memory contaminated the soul. Recollection chained the present to error. To be free was to sever the past. Acolytes repeated syllables. The initiate muttered beneath ties. The narrator recorded each phrase in shortened. He interrupted once. "How do you judge which name to erase?" Alyra replied, "We do not judge. We remove." Her hand tapped the mirrored shard. "State the name," she ordered the initiate. The initiate tried and failed. His throat closed. He inhaled, and then his voice came like a small bell. "The Morning Mother shut the gate behind her and left. Lyora called my name and I ran after her." The circle froze at the sentence. It was a full, specific memory. Closing a wooden gate, a child's voice calling, the slap of small feet against courtyard stone. The concrete detail made the crescendo in the pool abrupt. Alyra's eyes narrowed. She bent toward the initiate and lifted her mirrored shard. The narrator felt doubt flicker. Was the memory resistance or proof that the ritual worked imperfectly? He stepped close and said, "Who is Lyora?" The initiate's face curled with confusion and fear. "A friend," he said, "a playmate." "I forgot." He lapsed into silence. The sudden recall, then the lapse, shifted the group's balance. Doubt moved into the circle. The narrator watched as the acolytes looked to one another, seeking instruction. Alyra commanded with a voice that had practice in ending disputes. "Finish the erasure." She ordered the acolytes to fetch ash. "Bind him more tightly," she said. The ritual rose to a new level of enforcement. The narrator heard an acolyte, Maris, whisper, "This is harsh." Matron Alyra did not pause. "We do not soften the work," she said. The exchange was sharp and brief, 3 lines of argument, and it revealed a fracture. The narrator logged the voices and the quick back and forth. Maris's small protest, Alyra's doctrinal reply, and Palin's quiet reinforcement. "We obey the law." The narrator shifted his tactics. If doctrine did not yield evidence, then physical objects might. He scanned Alyra's staff and found the mirrored shard. In the shard's curve he saw, for a fluttering instant, a private mark reflected. A thin crescent scar that matched the marking on someone he had seen in an earlier ledger photograph. Names, he realized, connected across objects and signs. He stepped forward and thrust the shard into the light. The pool water slid and hissed around linen. The initiate uttered a name, Alyra's childhood name, a single syllable that fractured ceremony. The amphitheater reacted as a body reacts to pain. Eyebrows lifted, hands tightened on cords. Alyra's face collapsed into something else, an old face under the ceremonial paint. The narrator saw the vertical ritual scar bisecting her forehead loosen in meaning. He saw the pierced ear, token glint, with a memory that belonged to another life. Alyra's voice left her mouth in 2 different registers at once. "No," she said, then stopped. "The initiate's mouth worked, you knew," he said, and the word was a crack across authority. the crowd stuttered. Acolytes fled or hesitated. The ritual collapsed into noise. Alira gripped the staff and raised her voice, but her commanding cadence had split. The narrator moved deliberately, stepping between acolyte and matron. He did not shout. He displayed the fragment in his palm, wet and charred at the edges. This fragment names her. The ledger erased the rest. Why was Rhea removed? Alira's control thinned. Names tie us to stain, she answered, but her hands trembled. A young acolyte pressed forward, Val, eyes hard. Matron, what does this mean? Val demanded. Alira turned to him sharply and said, It means only that some ties are more dangerous. You will do as instructed. Vale answered in 3 short lines, arguing the point, and Alira countered in 3 small commands snapped in ritual cadence. The narrator recorded the exchange. He saw Vale's hesitation and how others took it as permission to choose flight. Several acolytes fled down the amphitheater steps, while others clustered near the matron. Alira remained, however, and the matron would not lose the spectacle. She lifted the mirrored shard and reached for the initiate. The narrator recognized the move from earlier records, an enforced completion. He lunged and grabbed Alira's wrist. Stop, he said, and the crowd fell into immediate silence. His hand felt the cool of carved wood and the dull buzz of the shard's metal setting. Alira looked at him with a slow, dangerous clarity. You meddle, scholar, she said. His fingers tightened on her wrist and his hesitation became resolve. The initiate used the opening Rhea, he said again, louder. Alira's composure cracked. She hissed, enough. Her ash-stained veil fluttered as she stepped back. The narrator forced her gaze to the shard. You carry that name, Alira, he said, a childhood name. Why scrub it in the ledger? She laughed once, not a sound of joy. Names are medicines and poisons both. She replied, I erased where poison grew. The narrator did not accept the answer. The shard revealed a private mark that matched the ledger photograph. The physical evidence tied the matron to a past she refused to face. The amphitheater split. Some acolytes obeyed Alira's command to clamp down. Others stepped aside, carrying names in their pockets as if clutching contraband. The narrator watched 2 groups form. One clung to ritual orthodoxy, voice steady in repeated phrases. The other whispered names like prayers, testing their sound. An acolyte, Myron, moved close and whispered to the narrator. She was once Rhea to someone in the crowd. I heard her called that in the market years ago. The narrator wrote the name down. He had his second external event in rapid succession. A whispered witness that altered the balance. Alira lashed out with authority, ordering bindings and brandings, but her voice lost its finality. The initiate, now half freed from panic, struck an unexpected chord of truth. He produced the thin cord token from his tunic and held it up. She gave me this when I asked her once what it meant. The initiate? And a hush met the claim. The token matched the bone talisman around Alira's neck. That revelation changed the scene. Alira had been both a figure of doctrine and a personal guardian in a past life. The crowd understood the contradiction in steps and murmurs. Outside the amphitheater, several acolytes fled with names clutched in their hands. The narrator followed the path of their flight and intercepted a fleeing pair at the courtyard gate. Tell me what you took, he demanded. They spoke in fragmented lines. A list of names, neighbors, kin. A midwife, names Alira would have known, voices that made the matron human in the memory of others. The narrator recorded these names and noticed how those carrying them kept glancing back toward the pool as if expecting retribution. Their fear made the situation immediate. The cult's control was cracking. Back at the pool, the ritual disintegrated into argument and confusion. Alira attempted to reassert power and ordered a harsher method. To use the shard directly against the initiate's forehead. She spoke the instruction and 3 acolytes moved as if to obey. The narrator lunged between them and spoke sharply. Stop. He reached into his coat and produced the half-burned fragment the scribe had given him earlier. He set it on the ledge where everyone could see the scorch marks and the faint letters that survived the ash. "This is the name you hid," he said. "You cannot both erase it and pretend it never touched those you guided." Elira's hand stilled on the shard. Elira's voice lowered. "You betray the sanctity of the rite," she said. But the riot of doubting faces around her made the accusation thin. The narrator pushed further. Who judged Rhea dangerous enough to remove? Who had the ledger cut? Acolytes avoided looking at each other. Maris, who had earlier protested softly, stepped forward and said 3 plain sentences. "I found the ledger cut. I did not do it. I would not." The matron ordered the audits. The confession forced an external event. Confirmation that leadership had ordered the erasure. That statement made the problem concrete and personal for the narrator. Ilara's manner faltered. For a moment she bore the weight of her own private memory. Her hands moved to the scar on her forehead and then away. A small group of acolytes, led by Vale and Myron, took the shard from her staff and held it up between them to examine the reflection. The initiate, eyes wet, reached for his cord and said, "I will not let them drag my memory away without naming it." He spoke with a clarity that steadied the small faction around him. The narrator listened and recorded decisions rather than feelings. He wrote down who would leave, who would stay, and which names they whispered as they dispersed. By late night the amphitheater had split into fleeing pockets and a smaller, stubborn cluster around Elira. She pounded the steps with her staff and proclaimed punishments, but her words landed onto faces no longer wholly obedient. Some acolytes knelt to retrieve names from leather pouches and tie them to their belts like contraband. Others folded their hands and repeated liturgical phrases. The narrator catalogued the departures and the names carried away. He resolved to follow the trail of fleeing witnesses at first light. When the route ended, in the cold pocket of the archive near the amphitheater, the narrator sat at a table beneath a small candle. He laid the burned fragment and the broken shard side by side. He wrote in his notebook, "Ilira, formerly Rhea, ledger erasures authorized. Tactic. Public ritual, private purges." He copied the list of names whispered by those who fled. He then closed the notebook with a deliberate, quiet motion and blew ash across the margin to seal a detail into his record. The chapter's immediate conflict, the ritual and its collapse, had resolved into proof and decision. The narrator had forced the matron's authority into daylight, and had concrete evidence that forgetting had become a system of control rather than unambiguous salvation. He did not write a reflective epilogue. Instead, he bolted the archive door, put the shard and fragment into separate pouches, and left with 2 acolytes who pledged to carry names safely away. His last act was practical, a choice to follow the trail. That final sentence of action, he stood, stepped into the courtyard, and followed Vale and Myron into the shadowed streets. Closed the chapter on the ritual, and opened the next stage of his investigation. The narrator burst through the sanctuary doors onto the stone quay and found the final unnaming ceremony already in motion. Suspicion tightened his jaw as acolytes formed a ring around High Matron Elira, and the initiate stood only a few steps from the black water. A shard of mirror lay half, buried in the flagstone where a slate had struck. The narrator reached toward it with the archive key clutched in one hand. He saw acolyte Mare grip the initiate's shoulder and heard Elira begin the first clear line of the rite. Suspicion drove the narrator forward. He moved on purpose, placing himself where he could see the ledger on the raised platform and the pool at the water's edge. He had come because of a ledger he had glimpsed earlier in the archive, because a column of names once present had been torn away, and because a marginal note had suggested the erasures served other ends than purification. He kept his steps measured. Every footfall told him whether he could reach the ledger before Elira finished the decree. The central conflict was visible. A woman poised to strip a young person of personal history under the claim of spiritual rebirth, while the narrator sought immediate proof that the rite served property and lineage as much as salvation. Elira's voice carried across the quay. "Elira, called archivist Lisa from the shadowed steps, and the tone in her voice made the narrator turn. He watched Lissa's fingers curl around the corner of a folded parchment inside Alira's robes. When Lissa's jaw worked, the narrator read the movement. She had made a choice. That choice altered the stakes in a single instant. The deck of the quay felt slick beneath the narrator's boots. He crouched and scooped the shard of mirror into his palm. The glass was warm where it had reflected torchlight. The initiate looked down at the slate pressed to their temple and did not speak any name. The acolytes chanted a short, precise litany, and their mouths were taut. The narrator moved his hand to the ledger on the platform and thought of the ledger he had seen earlier in the archive, where ink had been cut away and ash crusted the margin. He had arrived to interrupt. Doubt shadowed his steps as he weighed exposure against personal danger. He had already sworn to himself that discovery mattered more than his safety. He stepped onto the lower stair and a child in the crowd glanced up and mouthed the name of Alira. The child's voice was small and urgent. Alira tilted her head and the tilt silenced the child. High Matron Alira raised the wooden staff, topped with a mirrored shard, by the ash and the slate. She intoned, "We strip the chains that bind. Step forward, child of no name, and unburden the line." The narrator heard the syllables and felt the ritual cadence press at the edges of his thoughts. He had to act before cadence became compulsion. He moved to the platform's shadow and, with a single quick reach, plucked a folded parchment from beneath Alira's outer robe. He withdrew into the narrow archive alcove behind the sanctum where archivist Lisa waited with her hands clasped around the corner of another leaf. Inside the alcove, the narrator broke the fold and let lamplight fall across a roster of names. He read. Names crossed out by hand, entire households removed from the list, and a small notation at the margin in Alira's precise script, property reassigned, line erased. He felt the texture of the paper beneath his thumb and heard his own breath as if it were a second voice. "Lissa," he said quietly. Archivist Lissa answered in a whispered line. "Lissa, I marked what I found." Her voice was steady but tight. She pushed the parchment toward him and exposed entries that showed when a name had been unnested and where its holdings had been reassigned. "Look at the dates," she said. The narrator traced the ink with a gloved fingertip. The marginal notation showed a pattern. Families that had fallen into debt, neighbors who had argued over wells, men who had refused to comply with Alira's requisitions, each name excised after a public unnaming. The implication hit like cold water. The ritual did not merely erase memory. It excised legal witness and social claim. Suspicion reformed into a cleaner, sharper certainty. Outside, the chant grew louder. The initiate's hands shook around the slate. The narrator could hear acolyte Mare's breathing through the crowd. Mare's knuckles whitened on the initiate's wrist. The narrator moved back toward the quay and chose where to present the evidence. He would expose Alira in front of the community, or he would carry proof to magistrates. Either choice risked violence. Alira's decree changed then. She pivoted the words from purification to communal obligation. "We do not remove names for ourselves," she said. "We remove them for the line that must continue without stains." Her eyes locked on the crowd and her tone authorized action. Murmurs rose. Some faces flinched, others stiffened in agreement. The narrator recognized the effect. Alira rewired devotion into civic imperative. Acolyte Mare stepped forward. "Mare." "Not this one," he blurted, voice tight. "Mare. He has kin outside the shrine." Mare's interruption was both plea and challenge. Alira's fingers tapped the staff twice, a small rhythm that she used when considering disobedience. Alira replied, "Alira, kin who cling is kin who corrupts. Step or remember." The line ended with an order. The initiate's eyes flicked toward the water and then back to the slate. The slate's edge pressed the temple. The initiate's mouth drew taut around the air. The narrator held up the ledger. The narrator. "This is not a rite of mercy," he said. The narrator. "It is a ledger of seizure." He let the parchment unfold so torches could catch the ink. Muffled gasps traveled the ring of faces. Alira moved to intercept, her hand closed on his sleeve. A rapid exchange broke out between the narrator and Alira. "Put that down," she ordered, the narrator. "The names were crossed out after your decrees." He shot back Alira. "You slander the right," she said, the narrator. "You profit from erasure." The crowd leaned closer. The narrator's voice did not tremble. He used short lines to force attention. Lissa stepped forward, answering Alira with a low and controlled pull. "Lissa, the marginalia speaks. We counted reassignments." Alira's jaw tightened. The argument escalated fast. Mayor interjected. "Mayor." "Alira, you promised justice." Alira turned on Mayor. "Alira, you promised obedience," she answered. Mayor's face went pale and his hand went to his brow. In the exchange, two acolytes edged toward the ledger to snatch it back. The narrator shoved against one and knocked a torch from its sconce. Flames flared and the crowd stumbled. The distraction lasted only seconds but was decisive. It split attention and gave the narrator a narrow window. He held the ledger aloft and read two names aloud so witnesses could hear. The narrator, Harrick Tobel, crossed out last harvest. Property reassigned to House of Merrick. The narrator, Sarah Lynn, erased 4 months ago, well deed transferred. Hearing the names along with dates forced listeners to reckon with concrete losses rather than abstract doctrine. Members of the crowd began to murmur the same names with recognition. A woman called Woman in Crowd, Harrick. He argued with Merrick over the well last autumn. The mention created a small ripple of recognition. Alira's expression changed. For the first time there was a flare of fear. She lengthened a pause, then reached for the ash-stained veil at her throat. Her hand closed on the pouch of powdered ash. She mouthed a short phrase of command, and several acolytes responded by moving in to restrain the narrator. Lissa flinched and pushed a folded note into the narrator's hand. A marginal phrase that read, in a small tight hand, "Sever ties to claim the land." The note was the twist that altered how everyone would see the previous rituals. It turned sacrament into stratagem. The initiate faltered at the water's edge. A sudden, intrusive recollection struck them, a clear snapshot rather than an abstract feeling. The smell of barley in a family kitchen, the voice of a man named Harrick calling a child to supper. A slate slab with a youthful scratch the initiate recognized from a neighbor's courtyard. The recollection broke the prescribed blankness. The initiate's eyes went wide, and their hands tightened on the cord at their wrist. Panic spread among the acolytes.
"Mayor barked, 'Mayor, stop the rite!'"
His voice was harsh. Alira's fingers pinched the bridge of her nose. Her alto dropped 2 tones and hardened. "Alira." "Silence him," she said, and 2 acolytes seized Mayor by the elbows. The narrator lunged forward. The scuffle at the water's edge became physical. Alira reached the ledger, but the narrator had already pulled it away and forced it between himself and her staff. The crowd surged. The initiate stepped back with the slate still pressed to the temple, and their knees gave under them. Someone shouted that names were being stolen. Someone else shouted that the rite must continue to preserve the line. The narrator's shoulders burned with exertion as he held the ledger open to the light. A short exchange between archivist Lissa and Alira resolved into the revelation that had to be made aloud. "Lissa, you made the marginal notes yourself." Lissa, voice raised, and she read the notation. "Lissa, you assigned holdings after the unnaming." Alira's face went hard enough that the vertical ritual scar along her forehead became visible in torchlight. Alira stepped back and struck the ledger with the staff. The sound was a sharp metallic hit that cut through chanting and argument. She shouted, "Alira, if you will not let the community judge, you will be judged by the law of the sanctuary." Her words sought to reclaim authority. But the ledger lay open between them, and the ink glared like accusation. Then a new event arrived. A figure from the crowd seized a loose page from the ruined roster and raised it high. "Crowd member."
"Sarah!"
she cried. The name landed like a pebble into the pool of attention. People clustered and began to exchange short lines, manning crowd. Harrick had a mark on his hand, woman in crowd. Sarah brought water to the infirmary last spring. These concrete recollections multiplied. Listeners connected names with actions and possessions. The initiate moved then, and the movement was decisive. They stepped away from the water and faced Alira, the initiate. "I remember Harrick," they said, voice small but audible, the initiate. "I remember Sarah." The words stunned the ring. Alira's mouth tightened. Mare tried to pull the initiate back, but they pushed his hand away. Alira tried to regain control with cadence. Alira. Names bind the soul to corruption. Alira. Step forward and accept the slate. The initiate shook their head and let the slate fall to the stone at their feet. The slate hit with a flat sound that broke the rhythm of the rite. A quick, violent argument followed. The narrator. "You used names to erase claims," he said. Alira. "You defy sacred order," she answered. "Lissa. The ledger shows reassignment." Lissa insisted. "Mare." "Alira, we swore obedience." Mare countered. The narrator. "It was obedience used as a tool," he shot back. The exchange produced 3 fast back and forth bursts, and then a lull where all eyes waited for someone to make the next move. At that lull, Alira reached for her veil and knocked a small mirrored shard from its edge. The shard clattered and split on the stone. Glass skittered across the quay and embedded in the water with a tiny, bright ring. Alira lunged toward the shard and then, as if deciding, stepped back and vanished into the crowd with her ash-stained veil drawn up. In the motion, the ledger slipped from the narrator's hands and fluttered to the ground. Acolytes scrambled. Several people grabbed for names. The scramble scattered the acolytes. Some fled. Others lunged for pages to steal names back or preserve them. The initiate collapsed to their knees and put their palms flat on the wet stone, sobbing in a way that was not wholly soundless. Mare stood immobile and watched Alira's figure recede between torchlight and doorways. Lissa knelt beside the initiate and pressed a warm palm to their back. As the crowd pressed around the ruined ledger, a small girl pulled a page free and ran it to an elderly neighbor named Merrick. She handed it to him with trembling hands. "Girl." "Merrick, the well-deed," she said. Merrick ran his thumb over inked lines and his face closed. He looked up and said, "Merrick." "This is Harrick's handwriting." His voice made a few heads bow with recognition. The narrator gathered what he could. He found the torn corner of the ledger with the marginal note and shoved it into his satchel. He touched the shard of broken mirror and felt its cool edge cut the pad of his thumb. The pain anchored him. He smelled ash and charcoal and the sharp copper of spilled blood from a scuffed elbow. He felt the slate's pattern under his palm where it had fallen. Concrete details kept the moment from dissolving into farce. They gave him proof to hold and deliver. Outside the shrine doorway, Alira paused once in the shadow and turned. She held up the broken mirrored shard and inspected the reflection of flame and face. For a beat she looked like a woman considering how far she would go to protect her order. Then she stepped into the dark and vanished along the route that led to the township. The crowd divided into factions. A few men and women seized names and delivered them to those who had been named. Others burned pages in a torch flame to block what they called sacrilege. The narrator watched as physical choices replaced ritual words. The community no longer accepted an abstract doctrine without seeing the ledger and feeling the loss. He felt a shift in loyalty as neighbors who had once stood silent now took ownership of names and claims. In the small hours before dawn, the initiate sat on the quay steps with Lissa speaking quietly into their ear. "Lissa, tell me where you remember Harrick," she urged. The initiate began to recount a single scene at a kitchen table where a man called Harrick had corrected a child's bowl. The memory contained a chipped bowl, the specific scrape on the table, the scent of barley bread. Lissa wrote each concrete detail onto a fresh sheet. The act of writing returned ownership of the past to living people and not to Alira's ledger. Mare came over and knelt. He put his palms on the initiate's shoulders and said, "Mare, you did right by stepping away." His voice broke. The initiate answered with one clear line. The initiate, I will not go back to blank. The line settled the character's immediate arc. Alira's escape left residue. In the shrine doorway, the narrator found a scrap of a robe with burnished gold thread and a smear of powdered ash. He placed the scrap inside his satchel next to the ledger. The evidence was physical. The roster with marginalia, the shard of mirror, the scrap of veil, and witnesses who could testify to dates and deeds. The twist, the marginal note showing reassignment, had altered how the community could see the rite. It converted a spiritual practice into a legal vulnerability. At dawn, the township magistrate arrived because someone had sent word. He took the ledger and read aloud the marginal notes and dates. He recorded statements from Merrick, the girl who found the deed, Lissa, Mayor, and the initiate. The magistrate's clerk copied names onto official paper. The act of naming in an official record reversed some of Alira's removals. A small court hearing followed under a plain roof. The magistrate spoke in short lines and requested witnesses to give specific incidents and objects that proved ownership. The community produced them. A scratched stool, a clay pot with a maker's mark, a rope used for a well. Concrete evidence replaced doctrine in the magistrate's chamber. Alira's claim of spiritual necessity lost force when names and deeds were repeated aloud and attached to objects that could be shown. The immediate conflict, the ledger's exposure, had shifted power. Several acolytes stood down and agreed to testify. Mayor agreed to speak of his hesitation and of the moment he spoke up. Lissa provided her marginal notes and explained how she had marked reassignments in secret. The narrator testified about where he had found the ledger and how he had taken it. Each short line in testimony pushed toward legal clarity. The final confrontation arrived late in the morning. Alira returned with a reduced retinue and demanded the ledger. The magistrate held it in both hands and said, "Magistrate, speak plainly and show evidence," Alira answered. "Alira, the sanctuary judges the soul, not the law," the magistrate replied. "Magistrate, your actions affected property. We will decide with witness and object." Alira's face hardened, but she could not produce deeds that matched the ledger's notes apart from the ones she had forged on its margin. The council found those notations suspect. Alira made one last move. She drew her staff, raised it, and claimed sanctity. Acolytes behind her tensed. Mayor stepped forward and placed himself between Alira and the magistrate. He spoke in a voice that refused to be small. "Mayor, I stood with you once, Mayor. I cannot stand where lies take houses." He 3 short lines and then dropped to his knees and offered to swear to the facts he had seen. Several acolytes followed his lead and spoke of being ordered to remove names after the rites. The congregation unraveled through action. Alira struck at the ledger with the staff once, hard enough to split the binding, and then there was a quick, disordered shove. Alira turned and ran. She did not face the magistrate. She fled toward the river path. 2 acolytes tried to follow, and were stopped by neighbors who had begun to take possession of their own names. The magistrate ordered guards to seal the route, but Alira had already slipped into the township's back alleys. In the escape, she left the veil and a broken shard that matched the shard she had worn in ceremony. Afterwards, the narrator stood at the quay and watched the initiate walk with Lissa and Mayor toward the magistrate's temporary records desk. The initiate carried a fresh clay pot as proof of memory. They held it carefully with both hands. The narrator opened his satchel and read the ledger's torn edge one more time. He folded the margins into a smaller bundle and tied them with cord. The physical acts of tying and folding felt like a tiny legal ritual. The chapter closed on concrete consequences. The magistrate issued a provisional order restoring several properties on the evidence presented. The narrator and Lissa catalogued the recovered names and prepared copies to distribute. Mayor swore an oath in a low voice and stayed in the township to assist the investigations. The initiate agreed to testify over and over, naming the people and objects they could remember. Alira remained at large, but her authority in the sanctuary was broken. Acolytes who had once obeyed without question had testified against her, and witnesses now had physical claims. The narrator left the quay at dawn with the ruined roster in his satchel and the shards cut on his thumb. He walked toward the magistrate's hall, and then beyond into the town, intending to file copies and to speak to neighbors whose names had been taken. He kept one hand on the ledger's torn edge, as if feeling for a pulse. The dispute of belief had been turned into a dispute to be settled with witness and object, and for now the ledger's enforced oblivion had been partially reversed. The narrator felt neither triumph nor relief. He felt the weight of the evidence and the work still to be done. He passed Lissa on the stair and she said, "Lissa, we will catalogue every roster entry." He nodded once and answered, "The narrator. We will name them back. They did not speak of vengeance. They spoke in the practical language of tali and testimony. That choice completed the chapter's movement from suspicion to exposure to repair." Night gave way to pale morning as the narrator stepped into the market. He kept the ledger beneath his coat and the shards thin cut bandaged. A group of townspeople watched him, and a few offered questions about procedure and place. He answered with short lines and directions. The final beat was a small one and entirely concrete. A knock on the magistrate's door as he handed over the first photocopy, and a neighbor, Merrick, arrived to sign a dated statement. The knock and the signatures resolved the immediate conflict. The ledger's power to erase belongings and silence witnesses had been interrupted and partially undone. The chapter ends on that knock and the visible act of documenting names, not on a sweeping promise or a rhetorical flourish. The ledger was no longer an invisible instrument of erasure. It lay open on a table with witnesses and objects attached to each entry. Alira had escaped, but the community had recovered the means of naming and proof. The narrator taped the torn pages, stood, and walked with the ledger toward the clerk's desk where signatures awaited and the law would now take its course.